talk a little bit about. Now that we have the recording started, we're just going to talk a little bit about who we have here. So, first of all, this event is hosted by the Corvallis Platypus Affiliated Society, and we are a campus-based group. It was first established in Chicago in 2006, and they organized reading groups, public forums, research, and journalism based on problems and tasks inherited from the old, new, and post-political left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. So this is actually the first in-person panel we have hosted this year, but it is the 7th in total that we have had in Corvallis. And in addition to our panels, our chapter is regularly generating submissions to our free journal, the Platypus Review, which is available monthly across Oregon State University campus. We also host a weekly reading group and film screening series, which is our Introduction to Marxism, Wednesdays at 7 p.m. in the Valley Library. So next week, we'll be screening an episode of Oliver Stone's Untold History of the U.S., covering the periods between 1900 and 1920. And we have weekly meetups to talk about current events, ideas, politics, and history, which are Mondays at 6 p.m. at Java Cafe in the Valley Library. And I believe there is a sign-up fee at the front if anyone wants to get more information on those events. And finally, in the back, we have some literature from the various organizations that our panelists belong to. So we just encourage you to browse through those and look around after the panel if you would like to. So I'd like to start by just introducing our panelists. So I'll start on the left, which is Sarah Henderson. She is an associate professor in political science here at Oregon State University. Her research interests focus on the region that we are focused on tonight, mainly Russia and Central and Eastern Europe, particularly in the period after the fall of the Eastern Bloc in the 1980s. And she has written extensively on this topic for over 20 years and is the author of the 2003 book, Building Democracy in Contemporary Russia, Western Support for Grassroots Organizations. And then to her right, we have William Smaldone, who is the professor and chair of the history department over at Willamette University. In the mid-1990s, he was active as a member of the Socialist Party of Oregon, and in 1998, he was elected to the Salem City Council, where he served on the Budget Committee and numerous other commissions. And he's currently affiliated with Solidarity and the Democratic Socialists of America in Salem. He's a scholar of the age of imperialism, namely through the work of second international figure Rudolf Hilferding, and is the author of European Socialism, A Concise History with Documents, which is now in the 2nd edition. To his left, we have Mike Beilstein, who is from Corvallis. He most recently ran as the Pacific Green Party candidate for the U.S. Congress in District 4. He worked as a research chemist at OSU from 1978 to 2007. And he says he was politicized by the U.S. government's decision to initiate military action against Iraq during the Persian Gulf War in 1991. And this then expanded to his leadership of a successful living wage campaign, which then prompted him to run for an open seat on the Corvallis City Council, which he filled from 1998 to 2000, and then again from 2006 to 2016. And then finally, at the end, we have Jacob Perasso, who is a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. He's worked in industries for many years, participating in struggles to organize and strengthen unions through building solidarity. He was a freight rail conductor in New York State from 2015 to 2022, and then recently moved to Seattle. He's run as a candidate for the SWP for a number of offices, including U.S. Senate. And he says he began his political activity as a student in California in the 90s, joining struggles for immigrants' rights, against police brutality, in support of unionizing efforts of farm workers. And for over 20 years, he has spoken out in defense of the Cuban Revolution and against the U.S. economic embargo in Cuba. So that's all of our panelists. So to start off, we will just go down the line, and each panelist will have 15 minutes to deliver their opening remarks before each panelist will have a chance for a brief 1 to 2 point rebuttal of everything we've heard, and then things will open up to more questions. So if Mr. Perasso would like to start.
Yeah. Since Putin's invasion of Ukraine in February of last year, Socialist Workers' Party has been campaigning to defend Ukraine's national independence and sovereignty. We demand Moscow's troops out now from all of Ukraine. At the same time, we demand the withdrawal of all U.S. troops, both U.S. conventional and nuclear weapons from Europe and all NATO countries. We call for an end to the sweeping embargo imposed on Russia by the United States, European, and other imperialist ruling classes. Those economic and financial sanctions fall most heavily on working people, who along with Russian soldiers can be won as allies in repelling Moscow's invasion. As Ukrainians courageously resist the invasion, Moscow has stepped up genocidal missile and drone attacks on apartment buildings and other civilian targets, including infrastructure for electricity, heat, clean water, sanitation, transport, and other necessities of civilian life. More than 10,000 Ukrainian civilians died, mainly from aerial attacks. More than 8 million Ukrainians have moved abroad since the war began, and nearly 6 million are displaced inside the country. Despite this intentional civilian carnage, including Putin's dangerous action placing Moscow's nuclear forces on high alert, Ukrainians, with workers and farmers at the forefront, are resisting courageously. Tens of thousands have volunteered to join the fight to defend their homeland. We hail their resistance and call for the defeat of Putin's invading forces. Moscow is ruthlessly trying to claw back under its own hegemony those nations formerly incarcerated in the Tsar's prison house of nations, trying to regenerate the Russian Empire with Putin as Tsar. He insists Ukraine is not a nation and has no right to exist as one. It was the Revolutionary Workers' and Peasants' Republic, led by V.I. Lenin, central leader of the Bolshevik revolutionary and the 1917 Russian Revolution and Bolsheviks, that ensured the right to self-determination of oppressed nations trapped in the Russian Empire. Lenin declared war to the death against Great Russian chauvinism, and he fought for a voluntary union of Soviet republics. The popular revolutionary government went beyond legalizing formal national equality. It implemented affirmative action for oppressed nations, measures to right the wrongs of history. Ukrainians gained national and cultural development, not least the right to use their own language. Only after the counter-revolution, led by Joseph Stalin against Lenin's proletarian internationalist course, were Ukraine and other oppressed peoples again denied their language, culture, and national rights. In face of rising Jew-hating demagogy and violence today, there's disgust among Jews in Ukraine and beyond at Moscow's outrageous claims that its aggression aims to denazify Ukraine. Putin is himself a product of Russia's notoriously Jew-hating secret police, formerly called the KGB. More and more Russian citizens and sailors are demoralized and disillusioned. They were lied to about being welcomed when they got to Ukraine. They're taking big casualties. Many disobey the orders to shell civilian targets. Some of the Russian soldiers are disobeying. And inside Russia, tens of thousands of people have come out to oppose the war. And you see flower protests now as becomes impossible to protest in large numbers because of the crackdown. As far as Washington and its allies in London, Paris, and Berlin go, they have only one concern: to protect their profit interests and imperialist political interests in the region. US imperialism aims to reinforce its post-World War II position as the dominant European military power. In collaboration with other capitalist governments there, Washington has extended the reach of its armed might close to Russia's borders, including deployment of ballistic missiles in Poland and Romania. But Putin's efforts to excuse his bloodthirsty invasion on grounds of moves by Washington and other NATO regimes are as cynical as they are false. Sovereign and independent Ukraine poses no military threat to Russia of any kind. We lend no political confidence to the capitalist regime in Kiev, which backs the drive by Ukraine's wealthy rulers to lower living standards and job conditions and restrict political and union rights, workers and farmers. We oppose Kiev's ban on the Communist Party and the Happy Ukraine Party. We condemn the demands of the so-called peace movement in the United States and other imperialist countries. By demanding no to NATO, yes to peace, and no demands on the Putin regime of any kind, organizers seek to give cover to Moscow's aim to force the Ukrainian people to give up sovereign territory. In order to prevent a capitalist future of socialist devastation, reaction, world war, and nuclear catastrophe, the Socialist Workers' Party aims to lead the fight of the working class to take state power into our own hands, as Cuba's toilers did through a workers' and farmers' revolution more than 60 years ago, and join in the worldwide struggle for socialism. The objective situation today is that more workers and unionists are bringing to bear the class solidarity needed to effectively resist the accelerated speed up, longer hours, attacks on job safety, wages, lack of steady work, and social and moral blight produced by US and world capitalism's profit-driven crisis of production and trade. Over recent decades, we have seen a retreat by the labor movement, but that has bottomed out. The low point is behind us. We are seeing more struggles, such as those waged by the Bakery Workers Union at Kellogg's and Thornton, United Auto Workers striking John Deere, Teamsters recently winning significant battle at Cisco, rail workers that voted in their majority to strike, mushroom workers at Sunnyside, Washington, fighting to organize into the United Farm Workers Union. And around the world, we're seeing increasing labor resistance. United Kingdom, we're seeing noticeable increase in union battles. In France, a massive upsurge over the fight to stop the extension of retirement age. A long list could be presented, and it goes from China to Latin America and beyond. In the United States and all these capitalist countries, we support this working people's resistance against these effects of the crisis. This is the only force that can ultimately end war. Moscow's year-long assault on Ukraine, the first major shooting war on European soil in more than 75 years, has caused deepening shocks to the world order put together by the United States and agreements or forced agreements on other countries at the end of World War II. It comes on top of the sharpening competition and rivalry from today's economic crisis. War and threats of war are mounting well beyond Ukraine, from Europe to the Pacific, Asia, Middle East, and elsewhere. It's only through the struggle for a proletarian party to advance the fight for workers' power that in the United States and elsewhere we can fight effectively against war. From Washington to Moscow, Beijing to Berlin, the rulers are scrambling to beef up their military forces and looking to rework their alliances. One of the most important shifts has been between the United States rulers on one side, who see Europe and the Pacific as their sphere of influence, and Beijing and Moscow on the other. Washington is strengthening alliances with imperialist and other capitalist governments in the Pacific and Asia to defend their profits and prerogatives, as Beijing's capitalist rulers press their own economic and military expansion. Threats are growing over Taiwan, over competing claims on sovereign island chains in the South China Sea, over the buildup of US military forces from South Korea to the Philippines and Australia. Across the Middle East, Tehran's drive to extend the bourgeois clerical regime's counter-revolution poses the danger of an expanded war. Tehran is also providing lethal drones and other technical assistance to Moscow's massive campaign of missiles targeting Ukraine's civilian population. These perils are multiplied by the Iranian ruler's declared aim of obliterating the state of Israel, its promotion of rising Jew hatred worldwide, and its rapid advances in developing a strategic nuclear arsenal and ballistic missile delivery system. The greatest curb to these dangers is Iran's working people, who've risen up in the largest protests that we've seen since of any recent decades, since which includes the nationalities of Persian, Kurdish, Azerbaijani, Baluchi, and in the Ukraine situation, it's the same thing. It's the working classes of Ukraine and Russia, where they're the most powerful forces, an alliance of solidarity that could stop the Russian invasion. But we don't see any road to peace aside from this working class line of march to end capitalist rule and open a future for humanity. Class conscious workers don't have a revolutionary policy for peacetime and a peace policy for wartime. The aim has to be to take power out of the hands of the war makers. In this case, in this country, that's the twin parties of Democrats and Republicans. There are also no common interests between the working and producing classes on the one hand and the capitalist rulers and their parties on the other in combating today's mounting inflation, crisis of employment and housing, and bosses' intensified speed up and assault on job safety. Nor is there any road to either Black liberation or women's emancipation, separate and apart from the working class struggle to confront capitalism's social crisis bearing down on working people and their families. The same independent working class course is necessary to defend the freedoms protected by the US Constitution, a fight that is at the center of the class struggle in the United States today. As threats of larger scale wars mount, the stakes for a revolutionary struggle for power have never been greater. To build a truly effective anti-war movement in this country, we will need to use the rights and liberties codified in the US Constitution. They weren't given to us. Many freedoms had been won by the people centuries before the United States was established. That is, many of the freedoms we have in the Constitution, but others were conquered by workers and farmers and slave toilers in the course of the First and Second American Revolutions, which we point to as the War of Independence and the Civil War and Radical Reconstruction. The recent indictment of former President Donald Trump on ginned-up felony charges by Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, a Democrat, is an assault on those constitutional freedoms. Freedoms working people have a vital stake in defending and extending. The real target of this indictment and what is being described as the most extensive FBI operation ever carried out are the millions of workers who either voted for Trump or who did not vote for either ruling class party in 2016 and 2020. The use of the courts and the political police, particularly the FBI and its against political opponents, which includes Cuba Solidarity activists, the African People's Socialist Party, and many of the people who were on the premises of the Capitol on January 6th. They set this FBI operation and charges and everything set a dangerous precedent that will be turned against workers in our unions and all those who are beginning to see the need to fight against imperialist war and growing threats of war inherent in the capitalist system. Leon Trotsky, leader of the Bolshevik-led 1917 Russian Revolution, explained, all suppression of political rights and freedom, no matter whom they are directed against in the beginning, in the end, inevitably bear down upon the working class, particularly its most advanced elements. That is the law of history. So it's only along a revolutionary course, anchored in proletarian morality and based on human solidarity, that social relations can be transformed and replace the bourgeois morals resorted to by the ruling classes to rationalize the brutality of imperialist rule and war the world over. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll go over to Mr. Beilstein for his opening remarks.
Thank you. I'm identified on the program as being from the Pacific Green Party, and I do have a lot of loyalty to the Green Party, and I consider that one of my political homes. But I'm also a member of DSA. I'm a member of the Socialist Party USA, and also in CCDS. CCDS is Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism, and I'd like to say a bit about Committees of Correspondence. It's many of you probably don't know it at all. It was a breakaway group that came out of the Communist Party around 1991. And it was people who were dissatisfied with the authoritarian nature of the party and the lack of democracy. And I think some of the people that you might know who were in CCDS, Pete Seeger, Angela Davis, Manning Marable, these, probably any communist who is publicly known has probably left, and about a third of the party left to form CCDS. And we have a local organization of Committees of Correspondence here, largely because we had some ex-communists who are here, and particularly Ed and June Hemmingson, and which some of you local people might know the Hemmingsons, and also J.P. Murray and Knud Larson. And so they formed a local chapter, and they've been meeting monthly, since 1991. And I kind of got into that group around 95. And it's one of the, as far as my personal political education, it's meeting with that group that's really helped me to develop my worldview. Anyway, on the back table, we've got some bookmarks with contact information in case you want to connect with Committees of Correspondence. It's there. And also, back there, we've got some, a DSA, or it's not DSA, it's a Jacobin publication, ABCs of Socialism, which you're welcome to take. And and also some issues of Monthly Review. Monthly Review is a national magazine that started in 1949 and covers socialist issues, and that's been a major source of my political education, is reading Monthly Review regularly. And I say as a member of the Green Party, I'm not representing the position of the Green Party because the Green Party is very divided on Ukraine, and I'm not representing committees of correspondence either because they're divided as well. But so anyways, anything I say about it is my personal view, but I'd say there are a lot of people who kind of share my personal view, and just thinking of some of them that I can remember. There's Pope Francis is on my side, Chris Hedges, Matt Taibbi, Jeffrey Sachs, Seymour Hersh, Dennis Kucinich, Oliver Stone, John Bellamy Foster, Scott Ritter, Medea Benjamin, Noam Chomsky, Matthew Ho, Jill Stein, and David Swanson. So I think you know some of those people, but they are people I would consider allies in trying to bring up an end to the conflict in Ukraine and at the same time an end to U.S. imperialism. I think to look at what's happened in Ukraine, I think you can't look at it just, this is what happened in Ukraine, Russia invaded. Now, I think everyone here would agree that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia was a war crime, and it's defined in the United Nations Charter that this aggressive action is a war crime. But beyond that, I don't think you can say it was unprovoked. I think it's clear that that the United States did provoke this, and they wanted to provoke it. And if you think about, who makes policy in the United States, who decides whether we go to war, who decides what kind of labor policies and energy policies and development policies this country has. And there are three centers of power in the United States, and those I say are finance, the banking and insurance industry, and secondly the fossil fuel industry. They have a large say in what the United States does, and then the military industrial complex. Those three really determine what American policy is. And I think there was an understanding within these power centers back in 2021 that they could provoke Russia as much as they want, and if Russia responded, is all to the good, because they're all going to benefit from that. The arms industry has benefited from, of course, they're selling arms, like crazy. Of course, they always, have a good customer in the United States because we've got a Congress which will always, pay for bigger military budgets, and other countries that we encourage to buy weapons and sell to them. So the arms industry did great. The fossil fuel industry did good because they cut out, Russian fossil fuels coming into Western Europe and took over those markets. So it's been great for them. And the finance industry, we basically sent the world into a depression, and which strengthens the dollar, strengthens the American financiers. So I think that in the United States, those people who were in charge were making decisions. They knew clearly that they were provoking Russia. They maybe they didn't expect an invasion of Ukraine, but they thought no matter what we did, it doesn't matter because it's all to the good if we start a war there. And so I think that was a lot of the thinking that preceded the Russian invasion. I'm not going to. Well, I'll maybe say a bit about what Russia's intentions were at the time, but anyway, I think is Martin Luther King who said the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. Now, he said this during the Vietnam War, but I don't think that's changed any since then. Anyway, I'll just quickly say that there's a Russian narrative of what has happened with Ukraine, which completely justifies them. Okay, and I'm not saying that that's a correct narrative, but I'm thinking also we don't hear any narrative here except the narrative that our government wants us to hear. It's like this recent concern about leaked military secrets. So that all had to do with how NATO is more involved in the war in Ukraine than they want to admit, and the pressure that they're putting on other countries to support this. We have the situation of geopolitical argument, that the control of the great Eurasian landmass is going to determine the power of the world, and the United States wants to make sure that doesn't happen, that there's no unified force of China and Russia, Iran, and Europe that could challenge American hegemony, and so I think that's there's been a deliberate policy of encirclement of China, Russia, and Iran with U.S. military bases and missiles, and the threat of using them. But I think Russia stated clearly before back in 21 that they were not happy with what was going on in Ukraine. They wanted the Ukrainian government to accept the Minsk protocols, which would establish some sort of autonomy for the Russian-speaking eastern provinces in the Donbass. They wanted Ukraine guaranteed neutrality, and they wanted to end these talks about Ukraine joining NATO. And the United States was quite happy to challenge all of that and at the same time increase the fighting in the Donbass. The United States after 2014 had provided military aid of $1 billion a year to Ukraine, which financed basically this fighting against the Russian interests, you might say, in the Donbass region. So, and that fighting was escalated in 2021, and at the same time that the United States started talking about, well, we know the Russians are going to invade, we know the Russians are going to invade. And so the United States could have avoided this easily by not supporting the Ukraine military action at that time, allowing a supervised referendum if they weren't satisfied with the referendums that were held in the Donbass and Crimea by the Russians. But anyway, I'm not saying Russia was justified. I'm saying that there are narratives which justify Russia, which we're not hearing, and all we're hearing is the narratives that justify continued war and continued U.S. Military support for Ukraine. Now, one of the narratives which you have probably heard and have heard denials of as well is that there were negotiations going on in March a year ago, which would have ended the fighting there, and the United States and Britain stepped in and said, forget this, you keep fighting, and we'll support you all the way. We'll support you till down to the last Ukrainian. So I think I believe that narrative. I think the United States especially did prevent this, and it's worked out pretty well for the United States. One thing is the consolidation of this anti-Russian alliance. There's unless the United States is going to fight Russia, NATO has really had no existence even from its start. You could say during the Cold War era, there was you had the Warsaw Pact and you had NATO, and they were lined up against each other. And so if they were going to have their side, we had to have our team too. But since the end of the Soviet Union, there's really no reason for NATO to exist except as a threat to Russia. And do we need, and if we weren't threatening Russia, would they be a threat to anyone? My take on Putin, which I'm sure is not the only view of Putin, but my narrative about Putin is that he's patriotic. He's a very good administrator. He somewhat saved Russia from the oligarchs who would have torn the country apart to enrich themselves. And he you know, and he works with oligarchs, but he made it clear to them that if you want to operate in this country, you have to operate in the interest of the country, that you know, Russia has to remain a strong country. And I think that's, and so I see that's his motivation. I see that's what Putin is trying to do. He's trying to maintain the integrity of the country. And I don't, you know, I don't think he's a monster. I don't think he has dreams of reestablishing the Tsarist empire. I think he, you know, he wants to make sure that Russia is secure within its borders, and NATO has done everything they can to make sure that he's insecure. I say that the same sort of provocations that were going on against Russia, I think the United States is also carrying on against China now. And, you know, with the, you know, constant talks of and rearming and the arming of the Chinese province of Taipei, Taiwan. And so it's, you know, I think this is a pattern. You have to look at the entire globe, you know, who is really is capable of having a global empire, and it's the United States. And we've got over 800 military bases around the world. You know, China and Russia might have a few military bases, but they're generally close to their borders, and they definitely are not carrying out this process of militarizing the world. The United States has a military budget which is equal to the next 9 countries of the world, most of whom are allies. The only country that represents a significant possible threat to the United States is China, and you know, with China and that's only if China has some reason to attack the United States, and I don't think they do. But I think the United States is going to make sure that China feels threatened and see how much they can get away with. I'd like to say a bit about the decision to invade Ukraine by Russia, and I see an analogy to the Korean War, which you know, it's came to me, you know, over the last couple of weeks. But if you remember, the Korean War was started by Kim Il-sung, who was somewhat of a national hero. Korea at the time was divided not by the Koreans, but by the United States into a North and South Korea, with the Russians having influence in the North and the United States running the South after the expulsion of the Japanese. And Kim Il-sung was somewhat of a national hero. He was probably the only person in a position to become the next leader of Korea. But the United States had caused this division, and Kim Il-sung realized that, you know, he had the military power. He could just unite the countries and, you know, and achieve what most Koreans wanted. And he could have done that easily if the United States had not responded. And then the United Nations also went along with this, because you might remember the Korean War was a United Nations police operation. But anyway, so I think Kim Il-sung thought for very little cost they could unite Korea, and it could achieve the unification they desired, and he, you know, achieve a political victory. And I think Ukraine is much like that. I think you know, Putin, after 14 years of fighting in the Donbass, or not 14, since 2008, it's what, 8 years or whatever, that there had been over 14,000 people killed in the fighting in the Donbass. Putin figured, well, we can put an end to this. We can invade very quickly. We can get the Ukrainians to agree to what they have not agreed to yet. But it was a miscalculation, apparently, and you know, and instead, just like Korea, instead of a quick military action with a quick resolution, it turned out to be a long, drawn-out war, which with a lot more damage than the initiators of the war.
In the interest of time, can I get your closing remarks?
Okay. Well, yeah, I'll close and say that the peace movement in the United States, should not be criticizing the actions of Russia. Putin's not going to listen to when we say he's a bad person. We should be concentrating on what the U.S. does. The Peace in Ukraine Coalition has put out a set of 5 points, and I'll just go through those quickly. First, an immediate ceasefire, negotiations without preconditions, including negotiations with U.S., Russia, NATO, and Ukraine. No U.S. arms shipments to Ukraine. Prevent any escalation of the conflict. Don't risk nuclear war, and an end to any expansion of NATO. That's the Peace in Ukraine Coalition's 5 points, and I'd say those are what I agree is what the left should be concentrating on. So, yeah, thank you. I apologize for all you had to listen to this long rant.
Thank you. And with that, we'll go on to William Smaldone for our next.
Okay. First, I'd like to just say thank you to the Platypus Affiliated Society for inviting me to come and speak tonight. I'm very happy to be here with my fellow panelists. This is a really important issue, and I'm glad we're here to air our views. I know that from listening to the preceding speakers, I've already gotten some perspectives that I hadn't really thought thoroughly about, and I find that productive. My view is also my own. I'm not here representing DSA. DSA, like so many other organizations, is divided on this issue. But my position is basically as follows. Contrary to the views of some on the US left, including the DSA's International Committee and the Green Party leader Jill Stein, the war in Ukraine is not a proxy war being fought between aggressive American imperialism and an encircled Russia defending its security interests in Eastern Europe. This is rather a war initiated by an authoritarian Russian regime to reestablish Russia's colonial control over a sovereign country. For over a year, Ukrainians, including the working class, have fought heroically against the Russian onslaught that has killed hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians, transformed millions into refugees, and destroyed many towns and cities. In my view, the socialist position is clear. We must do everything possible, including the delivery of arms, to help Ukraine defend its sovereignty. I am not arguing here that American imperialism has played no role in creating the context of the war. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States and its allies squandered the opportunity to abolish NATO, which ostensibly had existed to defend Europe against the now defunct communist bloc, and to create a new European security framework that included Russia. It was an utter failure. Instead, NATO expanded into Eastern Europe, where it satisfied the desire of Poland and the Baltic states to enter the alliance as a means of countering Russian power. This process infuriated the Russians, who resented their decline and NATO's presence in the region. The United States also bears the responsibility for supporting Boris Yeltsin's corrupt regime in the 1990s. It backed his creation of a mafia-style capitalist order in which a small elite of former Soviet bosses were able to purchase state assets at fire sale prices, while most of the population was impoverished. Equally important was American support for Yeltsin's violent destruction of Russia's duly elected parliament in 1993, and the creation of a constitutional regime in which authority lies primarily in the presidency. After coming to power in 1999, Putin used his authority to launch brutal wars in Chechnya and other areas of the Russian periphery, to seize control of the media, to suppress virtually all organized opposition, and to create a kind of soft Stalinist regime where individuals can easily be packed off to prison or heavily fined for opposing the state. Serious critics, especially journalists, dissident politicians, or members of the elite who seek to challenge Putin, can simply be murdered. Despite these disastrous American policies, this war was not forced upon Russia. Ukraine did not threaten Russia militarily. The Russian assault was a choice made by a regime intent on reestablishing its hegemony in its former colony. Politically and economically, the world is a much more complicated place than it was during the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union vied for global hegemony. Whatever one might think of its system, there is no doubt that at that time, the Soviet Union represented a non-capitalist model of economic development and played an enormous role as a counterweight to the power of American imperialism. In many struggles for national liberation in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the Soviets and allied states like Cuba often provided decisive aid. In the post-Cold War era, we are in a much different situation. In some ways, the world resembles that of the pre-1914 era as a multipolar international order with competing imperialist powers has emerged. The United States, China, Russia, and the European Union all compete for markets, raw materials, and spheres of interest around the world, with the United States still by far the most powerful single force, with 800 bases around the globe and the ability to project its enormous military power virtually anywhere. I noticed that in Mike and my presentations, we really agree on that 800 bases number. Okay. The US, Europe, and Japan are also closely aligned politically, making them far stronger than their Chinese and Russian rivals, which have powerful military forces, but do not have the ability to project conventional military force to match the United States and its allies in NATO and elsewhere. Economically, however, the United States' strength has declined over the past half century in the face of new competition from China, India, many smaller Pacific Rim nations, as well as Europe. The rise of China in particular, with its Belt and Road Initiative, has intensified the competition for raw materials, energy resources, markets, and political influence in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. While the United States struggles to retain its global hegemony, China is asserting itself forcefully in the surrounding region, just as Russia is attempting to construct a Russian-Eurasian Union that includes the Ukraine and Belarus. This multipolar world is a dangerous place, and there is an enormous potential for conflict. At the same time, the world economy is more interdependent than ever before, and transnational capital has reorganized much of the global economy in ways much different than those described by Marxist theorists 100 years ago. Capitalist interests are complex, and as was true in 1914, to pursue them, capitalists are just as prone to want peace as they are to want war. War is always unleashed by states, and it is always a matter of choice. In 2022, Russia's ruling class made a choice to go to war. Having recently undertaken successful wars in Chechnya and Georgia, and having taken Crimea without firing a shot, it embarked on its Ukrainian adventure confident of a quick victory and of the impotence of the West. Today's socialists must not repeat the errors of the 1930s, when many underestimated the murderous threat of fascism, rejected rearmament, and called for peace. Opposition to imperialism and militarism is, of course, a core principle of the socialist movement, but so is resistance to conquest and support for wars of national liberation. Just as Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels backed the Polish independence struggle of the 1860s, and 100 years later, socialists supported the armed overthrow of colonial empires everywhere, today we follow the demand of Ukraine's people, including the Ukrainian left and the Ukrainian working class, to support their fight to defend their sovereignty and defeat Russian aggression. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smaldone. And finally, Sarah Henderson, with her opening statement.
All right, great. I actually have some handouts, so I don't know if people want them. I'll kind of give one or two here. I know, I can't. I taught today, so I was like making handouts. It's on my brain. But they're not very good because, of course, when I looked at them, because I ran them off as slides, they're like super small. And I mean, if you have eyes like mine, you actually can't really see the text. So I apologize. But I tried. Anyway, I just want to thank also Anthony for having me here as the kind of Russia person on campus. I have had the enormous fortune to be able to talk with the public about what's going on, but a lot of times it's with a panel of other academics, and there can kind of be a sameness to the commentary. So I really appreciate kind of getting the opportunity to broaden the discussion. So thanks. It's really good to be here. So first, I just thought, like, let's just take stock. If people are kind of wondering what's going on. So if you look at the first two, that's just kind of a map of Russian territorial gains right after they invaded in February of 2022, and that's the most recent map from, I can't remember if that's the Corvallis War project or what. But anyway, just to review, over a year ago, Russia launched an invasion into Ukraine after illegally annexing Crimea and funding a separatist movement in the East since 2014. And as we now know, against expectations, Russia did not advance quickly. It did not swarm Kiev. It did not impose a puppet regime. Rather, although it made some territorial gains along that kind of East Sea, the Eastern Rim, Ukraine pushed Russia back. By April, Russia abandoned efforts to capture Kiev. And then Ukraine launched a counter-offensive in September, regaining territory. So you can kind of see that there's been a shrinkage. And then winter, things have just been grinding along in this horrific war of attrition, with a lot of focus on the not objectively strategic location of Bakhmut. And so, I think that's incredibly significant in the sense that it's sort of shown this kind of terrible logic of war, in which political science research shows that if a war goes on for a year, then it's much more likely to extend for 10 years because you've kind of moved past points of negotiation and people's willingness to concede. And so, of course, along this timeline, all actors involved have raised their stakes horribly. It's not just a crisis for socialists. I think it's a crisis for any human being to watch this terrible logic unfold. After witnessing Ukrainian performance, so I would argue a little bit with the timing of military assistance, as well as the efforts of Ukrainian President Zelensky, there has been a continued escalation of military support. That's actually come mostly after kind of the initial pushback and then the September offensive. And while the US is the largest overall donor, because it has the largest economy and also is the global superpower, if you look at one of the others, you'll see that the Baltics and Poland, kind of either former parts of the Eastern Bloc or the former Soviet Union, are a lot more invested in the funding in terms of what's called GDP per capita. So they're giving a much higher percentage of their economies, right, to fund Ukraine and Ukraine's efforts. Putin, it's not just the West that's escalated in terms of funding, right? Putin has escalated at home by instigating even more repressive and punitive laws against protesters, announcing a partial mobilization, which has predominantly focused on promoting from rural, more poor, more ethnically diverse regions of Russia to try to keep protests down in the larger areas of Moscow and Petersburg. He has annexed 4 additional territories illegally, threatened the use of nuclear weapons, and framed the war as a civilizational one between Russia and the West. And so Western Europe has not only, and we could talk about, kind of imposed the most punitive sanctions, but there's a later slide that shows that Russia is now the most sanctioned country in the world. But severed financial ties in ways that will be felt for decades. So, that might be another thing that I might disagree with, or we can talk about, right? That I think actually the groups that have been benefiting financially and suffering from these sanctions are maybe different than what, we would have thought 20 or 30 years ago. And of course, countries that were not previously even interested in joining NATO, such as Finland and Sweden, which have always stayed away because they're close to Russia, are now members or trying to be. And so after a year, each side, Ukraine and Russia, because they both think they can win. So public opinion polls show that Ukrainians are 95% sure of victory, right? So keep going. This is not the West telling them to keep going. It is Ukrainians. that they can win. And so they therefore have no interest in negotiating a settlement. And so one of the things we really have to think of in urging negotiations is remembering Ukrainian agency. Right now, Ukrainians are not interested in negotiation. President Zelensky has said he will not negotiate or approve a peace treaty without Ukrainian approval. So there is no like US and China getting together and making necessarily Ukraine agree to anything. And in fact, the West would very much like Ukraine to sort of forget about Crimea, maybe give up on the eastern regions, so that then there can be some kind of negotiations. But right now to Ukraine, and by that I mean both the population and Zelensky, that's absolutely not palatable. And the sad thing is that at the beginning of the invasion, when Zelensky gave interviews, he said, Ukraine is a concept. It is not defined by its territorial boundaries. Now, a year later, it is defined by its territorial boundaries. And so we would like negotiation, but it is extremely unlikely. So when Anthony posed the question, how should the left understand the current crisis in Ukraine? You know, I'm speaking here mostly in my capacity as a political scientist that specializes in Russia. So I kind of flipped the question a little bit to think about what do we misunderstand? And by we, I would maybe think sort of political science. And then we can talk about maybe kind of what a Marxist analysis might catch or not catch. And so what do we misunderstand and what do we need to understand? This is not a crisis of the left, but more of a crisis of political science. I think we really misunderstood Vladimir Putin. So the media tends to portray him as this kind of all-powerful Darth figure character over the years. But political scientists kind of understood Putin as someone who really was there because his authority was based on different kind of power groups, right? Within kind of Russia, there were the oligarchs, there were also the law and order people. There was another group of old Putin allies from Petersburg, but there was a kind of logic to understanding how the Putin regime worked. And it was that despite Russia's creeping authoritarianism, a strong plank of the regime's legitimacy was improving people's lives. And so, Mike, I would agree that 2000 to 2008, what I call Putin 1.0, you do see, economic development as a result of high oil and gas prices. You do see poverty dramatically drop. You do see an enormous improvement and just people's stability, reversing the horror of the 1990s. That pattern tends to go away the longer that Putin stays in power, because the longer he stays in power, the more he's dependent on making this small power base happy. And so, but for the most part, we thought he was not a risk taker, that 2014 was isolated, he was going to grab Crimea because the West was divided, it wasn't paying attention, and then that was it, he'd be happy. And so what we didn't understand is how far Putin and the Putin regime had traveled from the 2000 to 2008 era, from what we would call a sort of a competitive authoritarian regime where there's still competition to what's called a personalist authoritarian regime, which really means that the figurehead makes a lot more of the decisions. And the reason why we care about that in terms of not just political science throwing around like fancy terms like personalist regime and competitive authoritarian is that there are less mechanisms to rein in President Putin in terms of making any kind of change with policy. And so also what we know about personalist regimes, because there are less mechanisms of accountability, they're less beholden to interest groups, they therefore tend to make more wild card and really erratic and dangerous foreign policy decisions. And so that's one thing that we misunderstood. And I think that's one thing that is a huge problem, right? Right now, it is still more rewarding to give loyalty to Putin than to defect. And I'm not sure if there's any kind of mechanism that's going to change that dynamic. So on one of those pictures, the symbolic picture of that, you see Putin meeting with the Security Council. I don't know if anybody watched that before the invasion. where essentially they were all brought and they had to give this rigged show of saying like, yes, we think it's really great. Go ahead and do it. And you can obviously see from the picture, right? He is this lone person, isolated, right, from these courtiers that just, sit far away and kind of give the assent. And so that picture is just that sort of sense of, how do you handle a personalist regime in terms of foreign policy? I think it's also a crisis for area studies, and I won't go into this too much because Bill just talked about it. We have a fair number of Russian specialists, in the US as a result of the legacies of the Cold War and what the government would fund people to learn, but not Ukrainian specialists. And so you're much more likely to specialize in Russia rather than any other republic. And so I'm telling you this not because it's sort of boo-hoo for the discipline, but because as a discipline, we hadn't really come to the grips with the fact that many of us were kind of replicating an imperialist narrative that we hadn't consciously thought of. And by that, an imperialist narrative, I mean, it's sort of buying the Russia-centric narrative of how Russia evolved and Russia's place in the world, right? So, and it was a sort of loose narrative of Russia and Ukraine have always been intertwined. But there's this thing called Kievan Rus in the 800s, and it kind of existed for a couple of hundred years, and it was like the head of Orthodoxy, and then there were these Mongols, and they came for a couple of hundred years, and then like at some point Russia reemerges and pops back up in Muscovy, and then it kind of gradually stretches out, and then it just sort of absorbs Ukraine, because like Ukraine and Russia, they've always sort of had this historic bond. And then, there's sort of World War I happens and Ukraine gets, there's the Russian Revolution, Ukraine gets independence, and eventually it gets kind of reabsorbed in the Soviet Union. But it's all like, it's all this like, intertwined narrative in which they can't, really be separated. And of course, Russia has a national interest in what happens because Ukraine has always been part of Russia. Anyway, so all of that is actually not true whatsoever. That's like this narrative that Russia tells, pretty much like in the United States. You have a narrative that still gets told K through 12 about how the United States evolved, and the 1619 Project is trying to kind of shift that narrative. And so one of the things that the war has done is kind of caused us to shift the narrative, right? Ukraine and Russia, like Kievan Rus, like, Russia did not reemerge in Moscow until hundreds of years, after this thing called Kievan Rus collapsed, and Russia borrowed the name from Kiev, right? So it was Russia trying to establish the link with Kiev, not that they were always together. And that if you look at the map, Ukraine actually, Poland has just of a right to say that it's, historically intertwined with Ukraine. The Austro-Hungarian Empire does. But the larger thing, getting to Bill's point, is that, what we need to address is that this is a Russian imperialist neo-colonial war. It's about restoring a land empire with political and cultural paradigms that center on the imperial metropole of Moscow. And I think area studies, we've had to reshift, right? This narrative that we've all bought from Russia about, kind of Ukraine is that's dependent of Russia, and really flipping that narrative. And if you flip the narrative and you actually have Ukraine be the center of history and in charge of its own history, then this whole kind of elaborate story about kind of, Russia and NATO, like, gets a lot more complicated and murky. But let's talk about how the left should understand this crisis, not as personally if you're a Marxist, but maybe what a Marxist analysis might mean. And Marxist analysis gets really watered down when it gets to political science. Political science is a pretty, I would say, conservative discipline, not in the sense that it like leans to Republicans, but just, it's really about kind of explaining order, and it probably sees disorder and revolution as kind of highly, I should say suspect, but sort of disorderly, right? So Marx in political science is very watered down, maybe paying attention to like the global structure of, kind of the global economy and how it might structure, the emergence and wealth of nations between global North and South. Or if anyone's read The Economist, Thomas Piketty, looking at kind of the new rules of the 21st century global economy and how it kind of, favors some and disenfranchises other, and explains kind of the widening wealth inequality. But one of the things that I think is so interesting is that a Marxist analysis doesn't have a lot to say about this crisis, because I think all of the factors, so much about understanding this crisis has actually not been structured, but about individuals and ideas, right? Who can imagine the trajectory of the war this would have taken without the specific decisions and personalities of two of the main players, President Zelensky and Putin? I think also what this conflict is really a clash of ideas, right? Ideas about national self-determination. I can still remember actually listening to Putin's speech before he invaded, and reading his essay on the historical unity of Ukraine and Russia. And I was somebody who was always, maybe less hysterical about Putin, but listening to the speech, he was truly unhinged. He was presenting a view of history and a messianic mission for Russia. In some ways, not too unlike the United States, right? They both believe that they have this like critical and unique role to play in the world. But I think this has become so much more than NATO and NATO expansion. I think it's really about the idea of Russia as a unique civilization locked in an eternal struggle against various constructed foreign enemies. And I think what that means is that Russia's colonial interests in Ukraine are actually not motivated by economic interests, right? Russia does not benefit economically by invading Ukraine. Just the sheer logistics of integrating Crimea was inordinately taxing on the Russian budget in terms of adding people on for pensions, for funding the road to get across to Crimea, to actually running it as a state. So what's
there? Can we get some closing remarks?
Oh, yeah. So, one thing that's so interesting is what, in some ways, what Marxism can't necessarily explain, and the fact that economically a different group of countries might be benefiting from the sanctions regime. I would say rising economies like India, Turkey, China are the ones actually that seem to be benefiting from the sanctions. But I don't want to make this all about Russia. And the last thing I'll say is that this is my fear, right? Much has been made about the renewal and Western unity with, agreeing on the sanctions. But if you look at one of their slides, you'll see that a lot of people, if you kind of keep flipping through, a lot of countries voted to condemn the invasion. But if you look at who's actually participating on the sanctions, right, it's a very, very small group of countries. And most of the world is not on board with the West agenda. And so I do think, right, that the United States is completely, the administration, blind to the loss of its soft power and the very real damage that it did during the Bush administration with imposed regime change and under the Trump administration. And so in this sense, what I fear is that Putin's rhetoric is such at a level of crazy that we've lost the opportunity, or the administration has, to actually engage in a real self-reflection process about what could we have done differently in the 1990s, what could we have maybe done differently with NATO expansion. And because Putin has been so over the top, we've completely lost that ability to have that conversation, because now we can just dismiss it all. And I think much to our detriment. All right, I'll stop there.
I'd like to say thank you to all our panelists, and sorry for anyone who I had to rush or cut off a little bit, but moving forward. So a point of contention that I have noticed among panelists is kind of the viewpoint on the sending of arms to the Ukraine by the United States government, as well as kind of what form the actual peace, proposals or the peace negotiations, what form that should take. As well as I'd just like to hear a little bit more from all the panelists about how they view the left should actually try to exercise political power in this situation to get their aims done. I'll just go panelist by panelist again, just starting with Jacob in the corner.
Okay, well, I would say on the question of arms to Ukraine, we don't stand in the way of Ukraine getting arms from wherever. they need them to defend themselves. But we don't call on, the problem is that US imperialism and Washington are not going to protect the interests of Ukraine's independence. It's not in their animal, it's not in their being. And we don't support any actions, maneuvers by US imperialism or any other imperialist powers. We don't call for them to arm or go to war to defend Ukraine. I think that's a difference, with some of the panelists. We look to the working people of Ukraine as the backbone of the defense of Ukraine and the opposition to the war in Russia, which is including and extending into Russian soldiers who, I saw one thing that came out, and I didn't get the source, so I didn't want to include it, but it was something like half of Russian soldiers, or no, a doubling of the number of Russian soldiers that are trying to defect. And I think that's where this thing is gonna break down. It's the resistance of Ukrainian working people. I don't see how Russia could take Ukraine without, and Russia's trying to take steps towards this, but a complete genocidal wiping out of the Ukrainian people and imposing basically a Russification, transferring of population that doesn't know the history or something into Ukraine. But I don't see that happening. I think it's breaking. I think Putin is more isolated than he has been previously. He's in the bigger relationship of conflict in the world in terms of the United States versus China. Putin and Russia now, I think, is much more of a second fiddle in this whole thing. Just a couple other points that I thought try to get. Well, I think one of the key things to try to understand about what's happened in the dynamic of world power is that US imperialism has actually been weakening over the last decades. We have a book and political resolution called US Imperialism Has Lost the Cold War, which is, there's a count, people say, well, what do you mean? Well, US imperialism sought to use the Stalinist regime in the USSR as a transmission belt for capitalist values and to reverse and deepen the counter revolution against the Bolshevik revolution in 1917, which overthrew capitalist relations. But just because when the regime fell in the Soviet Union, it actually stopped that transmission belt and U.S. imperialism did not gain a new expansion of capitalist production and trade around the world that was new life for world capitalism and imperialism. And instead, we're in the death agony stages of, I believe, of world capitalism. So that's with U.S. imperialism at its head. So while U.S. imperialism remains, I agree, the only country that could, or that has military all over the world and the most powerful imperialist country, its power has actually declined, not vis-a-vis other, well, also vis-a-vis some other powers maybe, but more importantly against the rising working class, expanding working class around the world. That's the ultimate obstacle to capitalist long-term survival. So I'm trying to compress a lot into a little, but I think that more helps to explain, because the U.S. ruling class, I don't think you can divide it between these different sectors. It's a few hundred families of very wealthy billionaires, but they have vested interest in all kinds of production and trade and markets and around the world, and their interests are in stable rule, profits, and exploitation. I agree that the United States government and the U.S. ruling class is trying to use its leverage to force Zelensky and the Ukrainian people to cede territory, in fact. And that's what, if you look at Henry Kissinger and what he said, he's laid out that Putin actually has helped us maintain that world stability. And you have to, see that. And, so that's why I would never call for, and nor I think in the history of the communist movement, call for an imperialist power like the United States to go in and try to be on the good side of history. And it's also why the Socialist Workers' Party opposed the United States entry into World War II, including, even at the same time, we opposed Hitler's rise. And anyway, I could go on for a number, I don't know how much time, but there's, on the question of the Russian, to understand why Putin says Lenin put a time bomb under the Russian nation. We have a book called Lenin's Final Fight, which explains how, what I alluded to in my remarks about Lenin's fight for the right of nations to voluntarily associate with the Soviet Union and how that was overturned in the counter-revolution, Putin is, despite his miseducation on many other questions, he does know Lenin was his enemy on this question, and it caused him great. And what he's trying to reverse was what Lenin and the Bolsheviks led in terms of the right of nations to self-determination.
And then, Mike, you mentioned in your opening remarks about how US imperialism served as one of the impetuses for Russia to be looking to engage in the conflict in the Ukraine in the first place. So would you agree with the analysis put forward that US imperialism is still declining?
The United States as an economic power is declining relative to China primarily, and as a result, I think it's that loss of economic persuasion tends to make the United States rely more and more on military, and so I think that's I see the real risk of global conflagration coming about, because the United States is going to be pushed into a position where their economic dominance is going to be challenged, by the lack of production, the bad faith actions of the United States in terms of sanctions and confiscating the international reserves of other countries like Venezuela and Russia and Afghanistan. So I think confidence in the United States is waning, and I think that as was pointed out, most of the world is not going along with the U.S. on sanctions against Russia. There's no single African country has supported sanctions. No South American country, unless you count French Guiana, but it's part of France. And and it's basically the traditional allies that have been supporting the United States in this, and that and the United States, I think they see this as a victory, that they've solidified their alliance. NATO is stronger now. They've of course in Japan is more supportive, and Australia and New Zealand, but I think it just as Russia miscalculated in what they were doing in the invasion of Ukraine, I think the United States is miscalculating in the response that they're provoking now, that they're making it clear that there is the United States, and their strong allies in Western Europe against the rest of the world, and India doesn't, they're not going to be supportive of that. China's not supportive of it, obviously. Brazil, South Africa, the dollar is actually a ghost currency. I mean, there's nothing really to back it up, but the United States is a banker, and but I see one of the big threats to the United States economy is the arising of a new currency for international trade and reserves, which I think is likely to develop through the BRICS nations, through Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So I'd say that the American empire is waning, and it puts the world in a very dangerous position.
So moving on to, so William, you talked a little bit about how your favorable position towards the supply of arms and generally speaking, and with the lack of international support that's been talked about a little bit in this panel so far, would you still continue to advocate for that position from America alone, or do you believe it needs to take on a more international character?
No, America is not alone in providing arms to Ukraine. There are many countries providing arms to Ukraine. Most of the countries that have large arsenals that are in our sphere of influence are providing arms. I mean, there are a number of things I'd like to say, but I know we have limited time. So I wanted to say that I think as Marxists, it's in a sense, it's our task to discern what are the class forces at work, right, in among the various belligerents, and to think about how they have structured, right, this conflict that has now unfolded. Then there's also the question, and this has always vexed Marxists, about the relationship between those relations and individual human agency. And this is what Sarah was talking about, okay, where you have leaders like Putin who have a class basis within Russia, but they are also people who have an enormous individual autonomy in making their decisions, and they can do things that it's hard to track, as Marx says, with the precision of science. Right? So that's a big challenge for all of us here, trying to figure out what has actually happened. So I've already stated what I think the Russian aim is here, right? And my view is that while we must always analyze and criticize and combat actions of imperialist forces, when it comes to looking at any particular moment in history, like the one we are now living in, you then have to make decisions on the ground about what to do. Okay, in the 1930s, the left fought among themselves, okay, about what to do in the face of fascism. And ultimately, after a long debate, right, they decided we have to rearm, right? And we have to face the fascists. Maybe the SWP was an exception there, okay, but most of the left came together, right, and decided armed force is necessary to defeat a genocidal regime. Okay, and that was accomplished, right? You had, in a sense, the forces of the Enlightenment coming back together in the form of Western liberalism and Soviet communism, right? All of which have 18th century roots, coming back together to fight the force that was fundamentally opposed to the basic principles of the Enlightenment. So, in that moment, as Orwell put it, it was the duty of the whole left, all the decent people in the society, to fight, right? And that meant you rely on British arms, you rely on French arms, you rely on American arms, and Soviet arms. Okay, despite what Stalin had done, okay, in various moments in the preceding years. Right? So here we are, a century later, almost, facing another regime. Right? And if you have followed, as Sarah has, if you have followed the evolution of this regime over the last 20 years, you don't have to read Marx or Marxist thinkers to find out what's going on in Russia. Read Matthew Gessen, right? She's a really good journalist, and she talks a lot about the movement of the Soviet regime in a kind of neo-totalitarian direction, right? With the kind of rebirth of the worst kinds of a combination of Stalinist and fascist regime, right? And he is now spouting this ideology in these speeches that he's giving that Sarah described. So to my mind, right, if this isn't an emergency, right, where you have to take immediate steps to combat this regime, then there is no, then we're not going to encounter another one in our future, except maybe a nuclear standoff. So it's our job to arm Ukraine so they can resist. And I just want to say one more thing. You have to think about where you would want to live. Right? I know that I would rather live in a bourgeois republic for all of its problems that I spent much of my life fighting against. Okay, I'd rather live in a bourgeois republic than in an authoritarian state. And if we consign a half or a third or whatever it is of Ukraine to Russian rule, we are consigning those people to an authoritarian state. It's not our job to do that. It's not our job to
And
do that.
cultural eradication.
Right. Our job is to help them defend themselves. And if that takes American weapons, fine.
And then, so Sarah, you mentioned in your opening statement how that a Marxist analysis might be lacking in certain aspects in this conflict regarding the individualist perspective on how certain actors are participating. And I think you expressed some disagreements with, I think it was Mike, regarding what Putin's role is and how it might have evolved over the years. So could you elaborate more on that?
Oh, that just, I mean, I think Bill was talking about it. I mean, anybody who is in power for 23 years, like that is going to do something really odd and strange to your behavior. Particularly if in that journey of 23 years in power over the years, you're gradually finding ways to get rid of the accountability mechanisms that are both horizontal, right? How within the state actors can check each other, and vertical, how voters can check the state. And so we always talk about as Putin 1.0 and Putin 2.0, right? Putin 2000 to 2008 was a slow slide, but recognizable. There was the Medvedev 4 years. He comes back in 2012 with the added addition of having a 6-year presidency instead of 4. Thank you, Putin, Prime Minister, for passing that policy through. And then what you really see is the shift in the administration, where the greatest enemy to the Russian state, besides the West, is its own population. And so you just see a huge kind of increase of policies in which you have to regulate civil society, not just NGOs, but individuals, the media, all sorts of things. So yeah, I would say with Bill, I think we need to be terrified about what's going to happen in the US presidential elections. And I think we all have a struggle, right? We all recognize US imperialism, but do we really want to have, say, for example, I was just looking it up. You know, I'm trying to think. Well, none of the Republican candidates, as far as I know, that are the front runners, have any interest in continuing to support Ukraine. And the governor of Florida says, I see it as an internal territorial matter. It's just not my business. So is that, again, is that the world that we would like to live in? You know, we may think Joe Biden is incredibly centrist, but I don't, all the other Democratic candidates, I don't know what they're going to say when they come out there. But you can bet President Putin is sitting around waiting for the US presidential elections and hoping for sure that there is going to be a Republican victory, because support is waning. And so I think the hard thing is, in real life, we have to think, are we prepared for that? And then, as much as we may dislike US imperialism, would you like a world of Chinese and Russian imperialism better? Because they are not disinterested players in terms of restructuring the global architecture. And I would say, given how they're maneuvering in Africa and Asia right now, in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative and the types of ways in which African states are becoming dependent on them and having to get loans and default and give up natural resources, it's not a prettier world. So, you know, I think the hard thing is praxis, like looking at the real world. It's unpleasant, but it's going to be even more unpleasant if we get an administration that's not interested in Ukraine at all. And that's a real big possibility.
And I'd just like to open that up to all of our panelists to just comment on, should that individualist mindset of who Putin is and what the impacts would be on the Russian people, how would that affect, in the panelist's opinion, the opinion of what the left could politically do in America to see things forward? And anyone can feel free to answer.
Well, I'm not going to vote for a Democrat or a Republican for president, so that.
Yeah, I think should.
And I think as far, I didn't really, said that I'm opposed to US arms shipments to Ukraine, but obviously if by some miracle that, the Congress and the President of the United States said today or tomorrow, okay, no more arms to Ukraine. Well, obviously that would not be a wise thing to do. It would, that would certainly encourage Russia to to increase their, their aggression. So, so I believe we can't do that, and it wouldn't happen anyway. But I do think that I think the United States could negotiate directly with Russia and say that, we want an end to this conflict, and, and territorial concessions are going to have to be made. And, but let's stop the fighting. Now, I think, rather than, territorial concessions are a lot better than killing everybody. And I think that's what's happening with US military aid to Ukraine now. We're just, continuing the war, expanding it, making it more violent. And the United States has always used this concept with the American public that we're the good guys. What we're doing this because we're standing up for justice and democracy and liberty and and freedom of the people. And I think the U.S. Military to aid to Ukraine is being justified on the same basis that we're helping out the good guys there. And I think the good guys would end the fighting and and make whatever territorial concessions were necessary. And I think Russia would accept Crimea and some sort of autonomy for the Donbas region, with staying within Ukraine, and a guarantee of Ukraine neutrality, that it would not become part of NATO. And so I think the United States could negotiate from that point that we will end arms if you stop the fighting and accept a reasonable solution. But I don't think the United States is making that effort. And so I think, I think it's justifiable for the left, whether it can happen or not. We have to keep saying no U.S. arms. So it's the United States cannot continue to be the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. We have to bring it to an end. And so, just as I said, you can't, if that were to happen, it might not be a good thing, but it won't happen. But I think we still have to ask for it. And so that's going to be my position. If anyone asks me, I say no arms to Ukraine.
Jacob or Bill wanna?
Well, I just have to say, I completely disagree with Mike's position of negotiating on essentially around the back of the Ukrainians. Ukrainians are the people who are fighting and dying to defend their sovereignty. They have asked the world to support them. The vast majority of Ukrainians support the struggle for their sovereignty. And I would pose, no matter how egregious American history has been, no matter how bad American imperialism is, I would oppose any repeat of Munich from 1938, when the British negotiated the surrender of Czechoslovakian sovereignty and betrayed the Czechoslovak people and essentially turned them over to the fascists, right? Which is essentially what you would be doing, right? Without asking the Ukrainians in this case. I stand by what I said before.
Yeah, I think for us, we're not part of a left versus right struggle. We're part of a class versus class struggle. And I mean, that's the Marxist, and I think accurate view of how society and the evolution of human societies is unfolding, and it explains the conflicts that are ongoing. The question is, which class are you part of? Which class do you think is going to bring forward humanity? Which class do you think can be the bearers of culture? Which class do you think can have the moral capacity to bring forward a socialist society? I don't think the ruling class has any chance. And their position is for a dog-eat-dog society that defends their own interests. They're at war with each other constantly. They're constantly in competition, and these nations will continue to go to war. Which is why I don't think why we would never support the Democratic Party, which has led the United States into more wars than any party, and it's the largest imperialist party in the world. The thing that we would encourage people to do is join the class struggle as it is. Join the workers who are going out on strike. Join a party that is based in the working class, that has a composition of working class. We're a party of rail workers, of all kinds of workers. Because Marxism is not a doctrine, it's a movement based on the real relationship of class conflict. So we don't say join an ideal, join a struggle for an ideal. We say join a party and a movement that's based in in the working class. Okay, and then just on what was discussed before, on the question of fighting fascism, which I think is an important point. What if fascist power were to arise around the world, some kind of, like Hitler, okay, would it be in the interest to support, the United States going to war? But the problem is that the US rulers will resort to fascism immediately if their prerogatives and privileges are threatened. So there's a book in the back called Fascism, What It Is and How to Fight It. And it was written by Leon Trotsky as Nazism was rising in a course to defeat it. The Socialist Workers' Party leadership was part of the 1930s Teamster union organizing drive. The bosses tried to resort to fascist silver shirts to smash that union battle. The Socialist Workers' Party leadership was part of leading a union leadership that organized armed worker defense guards in the United States that were prepared to mobilize and did demonstrations to show their capacity to outmobilize the fascists. And the fascists left. They didn't even bother to try to attack. They had the Minneapolis rulers had brought in the silver shirts from around the country. These were fascist gangs. They didn't even try it. But the fact is the workers were heavily mobilized and armed and capable of defeating it had it been posed. This is the only road to solving the rise of fascism, which the ruling classes will always resort to in a time of deep crisis of capitalism. It's driven by economics, not policy, and that day is nearer coming again when there's deep economic convulsions that will. So to throw our support behind any capitalist party with the idea that they're going to be a lesser evil is only to disarm us from what we really need to do to defend our class interests in the coming class battles.
I'd like to open that up to the other panelists. So the idea of having the left stand apart from traditional, like, democratic organizations in the interests of war in Ukraine in particular, is that pragmatic, or is that what are the opinions of some of our panelists?
Well, I was actually wondering if the time, does anybody in the audience have a question? Maybe
I was wondering if there was going to be a question and answer.
yeah, that's all. I didn't mean to cut that off. But
I think
just
that
thought,
was
like,
part-
maybe.
Plan.
If people are interested, we have
Sorry,
about
yeah.
25 minutes left in total, so we can run some questions and answers if there are. Yeah.
I got one because 1999, I think the Ukrainians gave up their nuclear weapons to Russia, and Russia was supposed to destroy them. At that time, we were part of it, and the UN was part of it. What did the US promise, and what did Russia promise at that time? I mean,
Well, so that's the 1994 agreement, and that was, so Russia was supposed to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. Also, in exchange for that, I think Ukraine was the recipient of, a lot of foreign aid through the 1990s, also in exchange. But I think that's why Putin's particular method of U2ism, which is, like, well, you do it too, so don't criticize me. I think, yeah, I mean, Russia is just completely ignoring the agreement that it made earlier in a treaty in the 1990s that it is bound by. And I have no faith in Russia's ability to negotiate in good faith into the war, given the team of people that they have that are negotiating for Russia. And I think that's something else to be concerned about.
I have a question. If Ukraine and the West, or whatever, how they determine it, were to cede the eastern provinces as a corridor of supply for Crimea, you could even look at Crimea stuff. I mean, was given to Ukraine earlier by Khrushchev to when Ukraine was part of the Soviet bloc. So it's like a dubious kind of thing. But having been to Ukraine 6 times, I find a lot of this talk about there not being a nation in Ukraine to be ludicrous. You talk to any Ukrainian, let's say 89%, what country are you from? They're going to say I'm Ukrainian, which is exasperating. Because I want to find out where their family came originally, Hungary, Austria, or something like that. But okay, there's a Black Sea Fleet, which is a strategic thing that Russia wants to protect, right, by keeping Crimea and that corridor there. But okay, isn't there even a greater danger if you see that they're going to strengthen themselves and want to take the rest? I mean, but also there's a really interesting question that I'm seeing all over the place, and that is with these doting, octogenarian world leaders that have advanced physical illnesses like cancers. Could those cancers not be affecting their ability to see events and things clearly, and or project their strength and all this stuff? Because we've got Trump here and Biden, at some point you think that they could actually keel over while getting their address. McConnell fell over. What do you think about that?
Well, if I just might, we've often had, well, maybe not often, but we've many times had presidents who have been debilitated in office and they get propped up in various ways. Sometimes their wives run the country and they just lie in bed. In terms of the current situation, yeah, well, if you're an autocrat running an autocracy and you become demented, when is the moment of truth where the minions will decide you have to go, right? Do they ever come to that point where they're strong enough to make that determination? Who knows, right? That's very dangerous. I think it's less of a problem in the United States as long as we remain a bourgeois republic with at least a certain ability to observe and check some of the things that occur in our administration. Were that to change, and I think that could change momentarily if the wind blows in the wrong direction for a bit too long, then all bets are off. Okay, and we could wind up with a demented hamburger eating lunatic running the country.
Do you see everything you've been talking about in the way you've been looking at it, and as also able to be posed as a existential struggle between freedom, the ability to chart your own future, choose your own jobs, travel around the country, which you don't have in this kind of country. And we have our own big problems with all these different things, which could be even said to be greater than those in Ukraine or, rivaling those in Russia. But what about looking at what's happening in Ukraine today as an existential struggle between, freedom and democracy? They got to vote in a number of elections, and then authoritarianism. This to me, I have a friend right off the bat, when they started bombing Kyiv, they had to go down their bunker. Her daughter was with her. They were bringing children in, their living flowing off. And this goes way beyond these traditional theoretical, left, keeping its own, sort of integral point of view. And it goes right down to the guts of what is going on in this battle. I have another friend that lived in Irpin, which is right outside Bucha, and they talked about seeing people shot in the street, civilians by the Russians. And this is unthinkable, that civilized society or whoever would stand by and let this happen. And I think all other considerations maybe want to be brought to that level. So you ask the honest question, are we going to allow this to continue to happen? Or a country that does this to be rewarded by giving territory, and it's strengthened in its, its purpose.
And that question could broadly go into something like, should the war crimes and atrocities be weighed in when making an analysis of, in your opinions, what the left should do in this case?
Right, well, I mean, I've tried to make this point, right, that we don't wish to consign people to that fate, right, therefore, and it is an issue of freedom and unfreedom, right? Now, are people fully free in bourgeois republics? No, all of us on the left would admit that. That's why we fight for working class emancipation, working class power. At the same time, as Marx and Engels said, okay, the democratic republic is the most favorable terrain for the fight for socialism, right? So we have a democratic republic of a sort, right? And we need to defend it. The Ukrainians, right, have a very flawed republic, okay?
Right.
But it is a republic, right?
Yeah.
And it is worth defending, right? And it is under threat by an autocracy, an authoritarian regime, a neo-Stalinist regime in some ways, and therefore they have to be defended. We have to help them defend themselves. To me, it's very simple.
The oligarchs are even coming on board with this. Even the Russian oligarchs, the day of the war, they were brought together. And they were probably looking at their likely losses, and they were, thoroughly depressed. I mean, a lot of the analysis tends to be blown apart, I think, when people see things at street level, but I really appreciate what you're saying, about the social struggle and, trying to.
Yeah, I can just say, yeah, I mean, I think it's an important point about the oligarchs in Russia. What have they lost in this war? In fact, capitalists in Russia. Yeah. So, because there's some comments about, individual, I forget the terminology used, or the type of the regime, but it is a police state type of regime. In which it's a police state regime under Putin, and those loyal to him. And yes, it's driven by this war is why I believe it's clear it's driven by this nationalist chauvinist, Russian national chauvinist above all. I do want to take issue with one thing that was said about the hamburger eating. I think there's more of a threat to our constitutional freedoms, freedom of speech, and ultimately attacks on working people coming from the enlightened vegans, if you have to say the enlightened. I mean, the idea that the Trump administration levied more of an attack on working people, I just don't think it's true. I think they're both. Look at the conditions of working people in this country over the last decades and the decline. It's pushing the declining economic condition onto the backs of working people. The United States now has the lowest, the life expectancy has fallen to 76 years old, the lowest level in over a quarter century. It now trails, well, Cuba, there's many other countries you would be surprised, I can't remember the list. You look at the rural areas of this country, and they're closing down maternity hospitals so that people are giving birth, in their cars on the women. Sorry, I know it's not politically correct, but women are giving birth on the road to the hospitals. This is done under Democratic Party and Republican Party leaderships, largely not the Trump section. And anyway, so and I think it's an anti-working class.
I confess I had a hamburger on the way here at the.
Well, good. Good.
Yeah, question about what is the left to do not only in defense of Ukraine, but subsequently, so in the future, you Mr. Perasso remarked about trying to bring about a working class revolution. So the question I have is, if we see an increase in arms going to Ukraine, does that impact, and as you remarked, there's an increase in Russian resistance and an increase in working class consciousness in Ukraine. Do you believe that in general, the defense of Ukraine changes the framework for a working class struggle in Ukraine specifically, or the rest of the world?
Well, I do think it gives giving confidence to working people in Ukraine, their ability to fight and defend their interests. They know themselves that they're defending these towns, and so but there's a class struggle in Ukraine. It's a class divided country with the capitalist class and miners and coal miners that, haven't been paid for months oftentimes, and have to fight for back wages. There's fights over freedom of speech and freedom of political rights and stuff in Ukraine that are going on. And I do think that the after effects of this kind of struggle have the possibility of giving some confidence to working people in Ukraine of their own capacities and abilities to fight in their own interests. If I'm getting at your, which I believe strengthens the hand in terms of the possibilities of a revolutionary struggle.
I mean, usually in time, I mean, isn't that the whole problem, right? Which is nationalism trumps class identity during times of war, right? That was the huge disappointment in World War I. And so how do we know? How do we know that there's kind of Ukrainian working class identity, really bubbling up right now? I'm just curious,
Yeah.
are you in touch with Ukrainians or no, I just.
No, it's a good question.
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say that I could say that there's increased class consciousness right now in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And I think maybe you had said that was happening. What I'm getting at is that going through a struggle like this and working people having to band together in different ways can give some confidence to being able to stand up to a coal mining boss who won't pay you. You lose your fear of war. It's almost my
experience from Ukraine, you have state jobs, and you get very, very low wages. So capitalism is being used mightily, just opportunity and people going for it. There used to be a brain drain in Ukraine. And from what I hear more recently, it's been an influx. They have some of the smartest people in the world there, internet-wise, and computer-wise. So a lot of people are now able to make enough money rather than being in a state job and being in perpetual poverty. $100 a month for farmers or for teachers or other people. I don't think it's that anymore. And I think they're aware that there's a marketplace. They are shrewd, very humble and amazing people. I think we have to support them everywhere.
I've got an online question.
Oh, of course, yeah.
So Desmond asks, the left in the 2000s was defined by anti-imperialist politics opposing American democratic invention of war in Iraq, the sort of the bring democracy. Yet the left in the present seems to be defined more by anti-fascist politics as expressed through opposition to the authoritarian Putin and new bent support or ambivalence for democratic intervention. What accounts for this change? What happened to the anti-Iraq war movement? In what ways do we live with the legacy of the anti-Iraq war movement, that it still resonates in this moment or doesn't?
I think Mike would be able to talk about that a little.
You think so? Well, I think the anti-Iraq war, anti-Afghan war, I think it's kind of being erased, like the anti-Vietnam war. organizing. It's, you know, the rulers in the United States are not admitting that they made a mistake in Iraq or Afghanistan. You know, they're talking about the virtue of that, or what they did in Libya, or what they're doing now in Syria, and what's being done in Yemen with support of the United States. They're not backing off of that. And you know, there's you know, so as far as the left, you know, I assume the left that was anti-US intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan is still against intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's just this is being portrayed in a way that that Ukraine, in such a way that the American public is buying it. You know, that, and so that you know, that this is not an imperialist war. This is a war of liberation. This is a war of defense. It's a war for the national sovereignty of Ukraine. And
Well, we're also not sending troops, like that's a big difference.
yeah,
too.
yeah,
I just wanted to put that. in.
yeah, I think if you know, it'd be a very different
Yeah.
situation for the United States if we did have troops there. But
Calling them.
Yeah, there's been a hand there and a hand there for a while.
yeah.
And we'll wrap up questions after that. in that case.
Could I suggest we take the 3 questions?
Yeah,
And maybe
that's
do
what- yeah.
all 3 of them at once? We hear. Oh, I'd like to hear them all.
Yeah, we can hear all the questions and then let the panelists speak for the last one.
Yeah, I want to come at it a little different way. I remember, how history repeats itself, how back when Reagan was trying to tell us that, you know, our problems are east-west, you know, like it's always east-west. But it was Jesse Jackson that said, well, maybe to some degree, but it's also north-south. You know, that's where our real big problems are. And I mean, right now, I believe a lot of these people coming to the border are the results of that. South America at one time was a playground for kind of an illegal CIA that would go out among these countries, and they're still doing it. With the Honduras selection, even before Biden got in, they can't even get insurance. They got the right job. So I don't know. I'm just saying, I'm not saying we should just drop what's going on over there. And as far as the Democratic Party is already saying, it has a lot of its people eliminated by that same CIA. So we're even lucky to kind of have one. And when people say they're both the same, I wouldn't vote for either. Okay, I said my piece.
You didn't have a question though.
I just want to ramble. I always was different. You know?
This gentleman.
Okay, so I think I've heard authoritarianism, fascism, like pretty politically charged words, which I think have very individual definitions, especially fascism. As Russia has used this narrative of the denazification of Ukraine as its supposed justification for invasion. I'd like to hear, like, say, the definitions of the panelists of fascism and whether or not they actually think whether, like, Russia as an authoritarian state, which some of you claimed it to be, matches your definition of fascism.
We got a rapid fire just across.
I would also look up an article by Tim Snyder, and I want to say the New Yorker that talks about, it's called Russism, or fascism. It's kind of, anyway, but it's really interesting. It's about how Ukrainians explain Russian ideology, or kind of Russism and fascism melded together. But I think fascism in general is a political ideology. It kind of has 4 or 5 core tenets, which, you know, usually has something about rejecting individualism, a belief in kind of the state and the group as the answer, a narrative which rejects maybe equality and kind of reinforces the idea that there might be a hierarchy, which is natural. And there's usually kind of a strong nationalist component. It doesn't have to go as far as genocide, but that's kind of just off the top of my head.
I basically fall into the same general camp as Sarah in terms of describing the kind of regime we have there. It has managed to combine many things out of the Russian tradition, kind of a pan-Slavic outlook, right, with a nationalist outlook, a racist outlook, a homophobic outlook. Okay, so ideologically, many of these principles, if you will, have come together in this regime. Okay, some of the things that one associates with sort of classic fascism, right, like the mass party. Okay, it's hard to tell the degree to which they're really there. Putin is able to mobilize people to vote for him, right, in the framework of this political system that they've created. I forget what his party is called.
United Russia.
United Russia. That's a kind of shell, right, that allows him to simply use the system that he now has to keep getting elected. I don't know if it's really comparable to the parties that existed in fascist Italy or in fascist Germany. I'd have to study it more closely. But ideologically, I would say that it's a fascist regime.
I don't know if this will helpful, but I think by definition, fascism refers to an alliance between the government, including the military, and the industrialist finance and labor, actually, all united together to work for the national interest. That's how fascism was defined. Now, of course, both in Italy and Germany, when they had fascist regimes, they pretty soon got rid of the labor unions as part of that alliance, and so but I think one aspect of it, the idea that they are united in the national interest, and that brings about this concept of nationalism, xenophobia, and excluding those people who don't quite fit, like the homosexuals or the Jehovah's Witnesses, and people who are not of the nation. So that xenophobia is the primary expression of it that we should be concerned with. But I can't really judge Russia. I don't know enough about it. I do know that Putin has consistently won elections, and I think he has popular support.
Yeah, well, I would say that when fascism triumphs, it only happens when the working class is completely smashed. In particular, all the organizations of the working class, the conscious organizations such as the trade unions, communist organizations, etc. And a dictatorship, I wouldn't say it's an alliance with labor in a sense, but it's basically big sections of the industrial capitalist class under threat during economic crisis, not something that they aspire to do, but under threat of economic crisis and under threat of their system falling apart and losing their privileges and prerogatives, their rule, they allow the fascists to walk in the door, which is why the road of lesser evilism in bourgeois politics is a dead end and ultimately disastrous road for the working class. Because ultimately, the only defense we have against fascism is for working people to be organizing independently of the capitalist class. So is Russia fascist? No. There's no country in the world right now that's fascist. Do some of these regimes use methods that are similar to fascists and similar to Hitler? Yes, absolutely. And there's various dictatorships and such that have used fascist methods. And I mean, some of the stuff is eerie, that you see coming out of Russia, the Z's and the nationalism, the things that the fascist movement would use and be part of, and the anti-Semitism. But there's also the accusation that the Ukrainian regime is fascist, which is part of Putin's justification, but nothing, there's some attacks on political rights, but it has nothing to do with fascism. It's farther from any fascist methods, I think, than Russia. But as we pointed out in my thing, I mean, they did close down the Communist Party of in Ukraine, which is a Moscow allied Communist Party of Ukraine. Okay, but regardless of that, we opposed the shutting down of that party, which they did prior to the war. Also, the Happy Ukraine Party, which was actually made up of a lot of people who opposed the war, and opposed the invasion of Russia, but still found themselves at odds with the ruling class in Ukraine. So yes, there's a restriction on rights in Ukraine going on, but just nothing approaching fascism.
Can I just add one thing?
Can I check on the time?
We're about to kind of, looks like there was one last question in the room as well.
I think we have time for the last question and then we will conclude. So,
Given the vast armament that is being given to Ukraine as one set of dual pronged approach against Russia, the second prong of sanctions is brought up. How effective are sanctions against Russia at stopping the war? And furthermore, is what we're hoping for in Russia, given the economic sanctions, a worker revolution?
I'm sorry, what was the half? How effective are the sanctions? And then what was the second half?
Given like the economic reality that Russian civilians are sort of like existing under, given the, the sanctions, is what we're hoping that these sanctions are accomplishing, like sort of squeezing the working class on Russia to the point where they have no other option than to
No,
sort of seek a worker revolution.
no, I think the sanctions are actually trying to squeeze the upper elites in the hopes that they will then squeeze Putin. But I think you're right in the sense that the sanctions have not had the economic effect that the West had hoped. So Russia only had a contraction of -2% growth last year, which the IMF had to downgrade from an initial, I can't remember if it was like an 8 or 12% contraction. So, and Russia actually made more money in 2022 from natural gas and oil than it had the previous year. So it hasn't quite kicked in as expected. Part of that has to do with, I think, on the map, a lot of the other countries that are not cooperating with the sanctions are actually suddenly importing lots of iPhones into Russia that would not import iPhones before, like Armenia. So they're getting around, and also it is true that technocrats still control economic policy, I would say, in Russia. So they've kind of been working to sanction-proof the economy since 2014. But what's really hurting are just things like, the workers are still employed, but say, for example, they can't put chips in cars anymore, but they can still roll out cars. But now all the cars are being made without airbags because those kinds of superconductor chips are sanctioned. And so it's having kind of weird and strange impacts.
I would argue also that the sanctions have caused certain disruptions in the country that might cause the Russian regime some alarm in maintaining their war effort. At the same time, the Russian regime will not hesitate to continue the war, even if the people suffer greatly. Because they can. And Russia is large enough and has enough of an industrial plant, even though it's not very competitive internationally. It has enough industrial plant to basically supply most of the things that people need on a day-to-day basis for some time. So the kinds of sanctions that are now being levied are, in general, not having the effect that everyone had hoped for in the West. They have caused some disruption. And even if they were to have really squeezed the regime, and even if they were to press the people's living standard way down, I don't think that would change the government's position.
Well, I just point out, I think, more than half of the world's population is under sanctions by the United States. It's a weapon that the United States has used. And I'd say in Iran and Cuba, Venezuela and Nicaragua, it's actually caused.
Venezuela used to sell oil now.
Yeah. Anyway, the sanctions, that the United States has imposed has actually hurt these countries, hurt the people, the working people. But But I also think it has the sanctions against Russia. It might be hurting working people, but it's, you know, it doesn't matter. It won't deter them from continuing the war. And I'd say overall, it hasn't really affected Russia, the sanctions, and largely as Sarah's pointed out, because most of the world is not going along with those sanctions. It's just, you know, the United States, Canada, and Western Europe.
It's it's impacting its ability to get high tech. So as, Bill was saying, like it's having an impact. And it's causing Russia to rotate to China and India. So, and we can say goodbye all that small percentage of middle-class Russians that dream of looking westward as opposed to eastward is over. And so that's huge.
I think we have
Well,
one last
I
comment from Jacob.
I think the sanctions cut across solidarity, that you got to try to see how this thing can end, is to win solidarity with the Russian people to fight against the war. And look at the anti-Vietnam War movement. It had an impact. It wasn't decisive, but millions of people came out and opposed the war here. So that's what we think can win, and it plays into Putin's hand, and it plays into his selling that the West is the enemy. You know, look what they're doing. They're all uniting to, you know, block us out. Their real actual one big effect is pushing a lot of business towards China. But I don't think also squeezing the working class leads to revolution. The working class responds to instability and ups and downs, but instability in standard of living over time. But the working class needs breathing space, experience to develop leadership, and it needs confidence to be able to fight in its own interests. And none of that it gets from having sanctions imposed on us. There's not an economic equation that at X point the working class rises up and takes over. That's not how it works.
I think we are at time, so I'd just like to thank all of our panelists for coming tonight and everyone in the audience as well.
Thanks for moderating.
Thanks.
Thanks.